Well, welcome to the Art, History, and Archaeology section. We have some really interesting papers today. We have 7 people presenting. So I'm going to ask each of them to make sure they stay within a 10-minute timeline, and I'll be in the very back. And when you see me hold up a sheet of paper that says 2 minutes, exclamation point, that means 2 minutes. So you need to think about wrapping up, and then I'll stop you at that end so that everybody has a chance to present. We have one person on the list, one person who can be presented who is not on the program, and she is our top graduating art history major. Her name is Davis Clem, and she has taken, she tells us, over 16 courses in art history, archaeology, and anthropology with us. So I'm going to introduce Davis Clem, and she can tell you what her paper's about, and all yours.
So yeah, I've written a lot of papers, and I swore to Jeffrey as a freshman that I would present at LASS my senior year. And he didn't put me in the program. I was like, maybe I got out of it, but I didn't. So here I am. Out of all the papers I wrote, I actually chose one I wrote almost 2 years ago and tore it apart last night and rewrote it. So here we go. My paper is effectively titled "The Road to Hell: Luther's 95 Theses and the Demise of the German Art Culture." So. Religion has been a common catalyst. Very good. Oh wait, I can do that. Sweet. Okay. So like I said, my paper is about Martin Luther's 95 Theses and the demise of the German art culture. Religion has been a common catalyst for the creation of art for millennia. Often relying on the patronage of spiritual institutions in the past, artistic communities were heavily affected when change occurred in the religious climate. During the Protestant Reformation, hundreds of works of art were destroyed in the name of religion. Sadly, the pieces themselves were not the sole victims. In Germany, shift in the religious climate ran deeper than in other European countries. Reformers, having deemed a large portion of religious art idolatrous, effectively killed the German artistic community. Employing allegory and analyzing select works of German artists, Albert Sturr, Matthias Grunwald, and Lucas Cranach the Elder can allow viewers to examine the downfall of German art in narrative form that is unusual. Changing the lens through which Night, Death, and the Devil, Melancholia 1, the Eisenheim Altarpiece, and the Law and Grace are observed allows for the themes of death and the devil in art to be related to the decline and eventual demise of German art at the hands of Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation. The Reformation was preceded by a legacy of power abuse and subsequently discontent people, which unlocked an interest for religious revolution. The late medieval times in Germany were filled with tensions between clergy and parishioners and were fueled by resentment of power and privilege granted to clerics. The negative impact that resulted from the power-hungry actions of the priests caused a downturn in the economy. The clergy and those with direct connections to them were exempt from taxation, leaving fiscal responsibility upon the shoulders of impoverished individuals. The value of untaxed items and services received by those with Pflichtfrei, which is the Middle German phrase for clerical freedom, which exempted them from taxation, left an almost crippling tax amount to be carried by the people. Due to the strain, cities attempted to restrict clerical privileges. Some were successful, while others were crushed by the religious sanctions that the clergy imposed in the defense of their rights. Some of the worst disputes arising from this problem occurred in Magdeburg, Germany, where in 1325 citizens murdered the archbishop. Later in 1402, the people attacked and destroyed the religious quarters of the city. Mainz was also afflicted with violent uprisings against the clerics in August of 1329, when 3 monasteries were burned and the monks beaten as the city was decimated by the inhabitants. Clearly unfair advantages from the Middle Ages cultivated the prime environment within which the Reformation was able to flourish. Martin Luther posted his disputation on the power and efficacy of indulgences, which contradicted the practices of indulgences within the Catholic Church, a Catholic church in Wittenberg, Germany in 1517. This has come to be known as his famous 95 Theses. The sale of indulgences began in German lands after Pope Leo X began fundraising in order to finance the renovation of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. Corrupt priests began to sell these indulgences as a means of limiting time spent in purgatory through either paying money directly to the church or via commissioning art for the church. Many Germans felt they were being exploited financially by the papacy due to their lack of concrete, organized central government. Luther's theses were a means of publicly expressing his grievances against the corruption of the church and attempting to bring it back to its purpose as a pure religious institution. Luther disagreed with the Christian militancy that was developing due to the corruption, and he also worried about the false sense of security lent by indulgences that were being deceitfully marketed as a means of penance and salvation. With a great rousing occurring all through the religious realm, many protests and revolutionary uprisings occurred, creating an even more volatile political and social climate. Between the intense emotions already present in the population and the extreme nature of change called for in Luther's theses, there was enough room for zealots to emerge and run rampant with bastardized ideas. This group hijacked constructive ideas and twisted them into a destructive force that led to a complete change in the social climate. Religious art, having been categorized as idolatrous, underwent a persecution that left many cathedrals irreparably damaged. With such an impediment imposed on religious figures and themes in art, a vast amount of artists were left abandoned in a dwindling job market. Without religious works being commissioned, it was almost impossible to find work. In an effort to keep their work from destruction, many artists turned to painting landscapes, portraits, or Protestant religious scenes, regardless of their own personal spiritual beliefs. The desperation of artists never did get better. Slowly but surely, the art culture in Germany declined and then disappeared almost completely until it rose again during the modern period. Pre-Reformation works such as Durer's Night, Death, and the Devil and Greenwald's Eisenheim altarpiece. Will you please go? Are excellent vehicles with which to explore the themes of death and the devil in art through an allegorical lens. Night, Death, and the Devil, created in 1513, is an engraving that portrays a knight accompanied by death, portrayed as a skeleton, and the devil, characterized as a one-horned goat monster, traveling down a road that is in a state of decay. This engraving is rich with opportunity for creating a parallel between the Reformation and the death of German art. Although a common interpretation is that the knight is Martin Luther, writing past all of the evil that was occurring in the Catholic Church, making him seem brave and strong in dark times, it can also be argued that he could be viewed as the devil instead. Though Durer did have immense respect for the religious reformer Luther, he was still an artist with a vested interest in the vitality of the art realm. Following this line of thinking, the knight could represent art soldiering on through a treacherous time, even though the outlook was dim and the hope was decayed. As such, the devil would be Martin Luther. He was the instigator of the trials and tribulations experienced leading up to the decline of art. This is parallel to Satan, being the cause of trials that perpetrated the fall of man. With these two pieces identified, then it is sure to say death's presence is an ever-looming sign that the time is running out, embellished by the hourglass that he's holding. It is worth mentioning, however, that death does appear to be mourning the demise that he symbolizes. Despite death looming ever closer, and the devil constantly on its tail, art attempted to carry on bravely and did so all the way to its end. Lastly, for this image, there is a bright kingdom on the hill, which represents the Reformation. It is shining bright, prospering, and making its presence known to all those who can see it, while the German art world was, in this engraving, literally going through hell. Greenwald's Eisenheim altarpiece, finished in 1516, depicts the scenes from the stories of Christ, most notably the crucifixion, lamentation, and his resurrection. When the altarpiece is closed, the scene of the crucifixion is the focal point. Crucifixion is a slow, drawn-out, and painful death, something that it had in common with the demise of the art culture in Germany. Here, parallel can be drawn between the Jewish high priest that called for the crucifixion of Christ and the Protestant zealots that demanded the destruction and discontinuation of most religious art. As art was declining, it was heavily lamented both by those who were directly involved with the artistic realm and by those who enjoyed the joy that art brought to the world. The lamentation scene at the bottom of the altarpiece can be viewed as a representation of the bereavement that occurred during and after the downfall of art. The women surrounding the body of Christ represent the artists that relied so heavily on religious art to make a living. When the altarpiece is open, the second scene from the left depicts the birth of the Christ child and the rejoicing that occurred in heaven. Examining this panel closer reveals that Lucifer is present during the celebration. The way he looks to God during the Christ child's birth forges another potential parallel in the allegory of Martin Luther as the devil. As the heavens and earth celebrate the coming of their Messiah, Lucifer looks unsure as to what is to come. Though Satan was the facilitator for the original sin, as the story goes in the book of Genesis, he did not know exactly what the change he necessitated, being the Christ child, would bring. Martin Luther, by posting his 95 Theses, catalyzed the process that caused the decimation of art in Germany. Luther did not know exactly what his revolution would spark, just as Satan did not know exactly what he was bringing about before the Christ child was brought to earth. According to the Bible, when the Messiah arrived, he was to change the negative aspects of religion in the world and bring in hope. However, with the abolition of the old law, Hebrew feast days and other enjoyable occurrences were also done away with. The Reformation was meant to do much the same thing by changing the negative parts of the church and invigorating the positive religious experience. This new view of religion gave birth to the iconoclast movement, which is in opposition to the use of religious images and an intense disagreement with symbolizing sacred figures and physical forms, effectively spelling out destruction for the previously accepted conventions for art. Closer to the despondent feel of Night, Death, and the Devil is Durer's Melancholy of One. It can easily be interpreted as a scene of mourning loss of the artistic culture during the Reformation. In 1514, the 1514 piece depicts a preternatural figure resembling the traditional view of an angel sitting and looking sullen and depressed while a glow creeps closer over the horizon, studying the image once again from the point of a spurned artist of the Reformation. The figure could represent any artist or the art world as a whole, mourning its demise at the hands of the zealots in the Reformation, represented as the light emanating from the background. As the light grows brighter, one would seemingly think that the preternatural figure would begin to appear weaker, almost as though her desire to live is decaying. The fate of artists was much the same as that of the figure, in that as the movement grew stronger, artistic inspiration fell into despair and eventually disintegrated due to lack of work and available thematic material outside of landscapes and the odd portraits. Lucas Cranach the Elder, however, took to painting Protestant religious scenes rather than fade off into the oil on canvas sunset like a lot of artists did. His work did not focus so much on important religious characters, but overarching themes such as salvation from sin and hell and the glory of heaven. In the 1526 piece, The Law and Grace, he juxtaposed the devil, death, and hell with Christ, eternal life, and heaven, with the tree acting as the partition between them. An allegory between these religious figures and the art crisis of the Reformation can be made. A display of the Reformation's effect on art on the left side, with suffering and death, represents the chaos that was reality for artists and their personal well-being as the decline occurred. Imagine having the only source of income being torn away with almost little to no warning. That is certainly chaotic. The skeleton could be said to be a Protestant zealot driving the artist straight to hell. On the other side of the tree is Christ being crucified, potentially signifying the challenge against Catholicism, and the resurrection representing the rise of Protestantism. As the Reformation appears as a bright new prospect on the religious horizon, the consequential prosecution, decline, and ultimate disgrace of the German art culture for a time is essentially occurring in the background of the movement. When the dates of the aforementioned pieces are taken into consideration, it is made quite clear that 3 out of the 4 pieces analyzed were made before Luther's 95 Theses were ever nailed to the door of Catholic Church. The 4th, being made in 1526, was Oak Reformation work. The idea behind this examination was never to suggest that artists were predicting the future, nor were they subliminally calling Martin Luther Satan. To argue that Martin Luther was ever deliberately portrayed as a devil is a brave assertion at best. None of the works ever had intentional allegory to the Reformation, all in conjunction with the decline of the art movement. However, the fact that they were not condemning Luther is not to say that they were intentionally elevating him in any way, which is a common argument you find in many art texts. A favorite professor of mine often says, "Be wary, do not bow down to false gods," in an effort to make her students reach beyond the presented ideas and forge their own concepts of the world. Surely, Martin Luther has been weighed in the balance with art and has been found wanting. Perhaps the road to hell really is paved with good intentions.
Okay. Thanks, Dave. We'll save time at the end for questions for any of them if you like. And our next presenter is Jeff. He's going to be giving us a presentation on moving to the modern world with suprematism, futurism, cubism.
Cool. My name's Jeff, so I'm going to be doing the next presentation, and I've entitled it From Picasso's Frustration. That wasn't the original title. It was actually going to be called From Picasso's Ineptitude, but I had mentioned kind of, because every Picasso I've seen, I think, before I actually took modern art, I thought could have been drawn by a 3-year-old. I told this to Professor Lowell, and he promptly pimp-slapped me down. So, so it got changed to a new way of Picasso was trying to express himself. So the assignment was to look at cubism, futurism, suprematism, and I'm going to not pronounce this right, style? Okay. And look at these art styles and then try and find an overarching theme. And I think it really, kind of started the new art revolution, or the new art movement in modern art really started with Picasso. So I'm going to start with Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. I'm going to read the introduction and my conclusion and try and, give you guys just the gist of what's going on. So everybody knows that Picasso had performance issues. It's not to say that he had trouble painting or that his paintings were not worth untold millions, or that he did not influence every other painter in the modern era. No, Picasso was a technically talented, classically trained realist painter that was frustrated, but he was a frustrated and confined man. It was as if the Academy had curbed his talents and that he actually had so grandly mastered. It could be even argued that Picasso, because of his frustrations with classicism, was forced to remake his chosen profession so that he could succeed in it. As a new artist, he learned he needed breathing space. Even though he was technically talented, Picasso's real talents were in the conceptual context in which he worked.
Jeff, hang on, Jeff. Everybody come in.
Sure.
I'm sorry to interrupt you.
Sorry.
Everybody come in.
You're famous, Jeff, people want to hear it.
I guess so.
You ever seen the press do that before?
No, but I wish I had taken a picture.
I'm sorry, Jeff.
That's okay.
All right.
So his real talents were in the conceptual context of the world that he worked in. In an era of war, manufacturing, and communication, and other technological advancements that were changing the basic assumptions of the world, Picasso and other artists that the underlying assumptions of art had to change as well. So following Picasso's lead, the proponents of the new forms of art styles that were painting actively broke the rules and sought new ways to redefine the visual image. Cubism, Futurism, Suprematism, Distill, these isms, all influenced directly or indirectly by Picasso and his contemporaries, confirmed that their talent for innovation, their struggle to find new modes of expression, and their much-needed return to the basic theory of art. It is in these achievements that the respective works contained within this paper that make these movements so important in the history of art. So to understand these movements and how they affected the arts, it's important to start the examination with Picasso when he really had 1 foot in the past and 1 foot into the future, straddling the chasm, his own personal chasm of frustration and his will. So, all right. So Picasso, this is essentially Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, and this is one of the most important, probably one of the most important pieces of modern art, or the most important pieces of art in the 20th century. In the piece, you see his influences of primitivism, and the scene is a haunting scene of 5 women who don't strictly fall into cubism, but are more in the traditions of Fauvism. It's a transitional piece in that it actually goes from the Fauvism over into cubism, and the actual the most shocking part of this is actually this image right here of this woman. The broken forms and the warped perspectives of actually that's not it. Okay, the reductionism of the forms of this form, where you actually see that her left breast has become essentially a square. This is what gives cubism its start, and that you can actually represent form in such a basic and abstract way. So Picasso later evolved into other forms of cubism, and the evidence of the spreading ideas of fracturing time and space. As well, during his collaboration with George Braques, other artists reordered the elements of the physical world within the shallow depths of the respective compositions, using the human figure as a pretext for an elaborate scaffolding of shifting and interpreting planes. These artists, now Picasso and Braque, tended towards figurism, or tended to make sure that there was a figure within their work. They weren't like Kandinsky, who's completely abstract. Both Braque and Picasso place their arts in the material realm, and they simply have reinterpreted, they have simply reinterpreted the concepts of perspective, size, distance, and representation. So within George Braque's work, you actually see here the Portuguese, which I find it makes more sense in the first 2 seconds that I actually look at it, because I can see the figure and form, but then I get lost into the figure and form. I think that that's one of the things that's really great about this piece of work. So in this work, Braque has totally broken down the geometric forms that surround his subject. There's only a hint of a guitar in the outline of a figure that remain. You can sort of see, I tend to look at these as eyes. I don't know if that's a smiling mouth and a nose. Then you've got the sound hole for the guitar and the strings. The action in the scene that the scene is illustrated is frantic yet ordered with actions of strokes around the subject. The contrast between the serenity of the subject and the action that surrounds it creates a tension, similar to how one feels about waiting in a busy public space. As well, Braque's introduction of words into his painting, a practice adopted by Picasso, was one of the many Cubist innovations that had far-reaching implications for modern art. The representation of the typewritten font, emblematic of the massive amounts of newspapers that were in circulation, invokes the populist everyday experience within the cities. The common man approaches I don't know what that means. Okay. But essentially, what it means is that there's also a new citizenry approach to government. So newspapers, you know, if you ever read your Anderson, Core 302, you know that newspapers are really where nationalism lives. So this is kind of the language that Picasso and Braque were talking in as well. The intended audience. Okay, so let's go on to the next one. So, as if to echo the frustrations that originally drove Picasso and others to find new ways to express themselves, the futurists, also Filippo Tommaso Marinetti, he declared that mythology and the mystic idea are defeated at last. So like the Cubists, the Italian futurists were seeking new ways to reinterpret their world. They were specifically obsessed with the coming changes in machinery, material, and technology. They embraced change almost to the point of fanaticism and shunned the traditional institutions like the Renaissance disciplines. One mode that they utilized to illustrate these was the emphasis of speed. Everything is a movement. Everything rushes forward. Everything is in constant swift change, a cacophonous celebration of modernity. This rule was not only applied to things, dogs or people. Apparently dogs were very popular among the Italian futurists, but to immaterial objects as well, or to simple material objects as well. As is seen in I can't speak Italian. Giacomo? Okay, Balla's street light. In this work, Balla created an optical illusion of light rays that translate into dazzling colors so intense that they appear to vibrate. The light rushes out of the lamp so fast that the ends curl over onto themselves. The entire composition vibrates with activity, and the light flies apart into components of color, into the components of color, red, yellow, green, and blue. There is a speed and intensity in the piece that is typical within the futurists. Another of the futurists, Umberto Bosch. Oh boy. Okay, Umberto, you see his name right there. Good. All right. Versioni. I speak French. All right. Unique forms of continuity in space also conveys this sense of intensity and speed. Boccioni's sculpture ardently strides forward and confident in its destination. The distortion of the forms conveys the speed and a sense of glory. The golden coating on the figure is almost flame-like, invoking the imagery of metalworking, something that the futurists embrace. And so, this is a quote from one of the Futurist manifestos. And so, faces smeared with good factory muck, plastered with metallic waste and senseless sweat, a celestial soot. We bruised our arms in slings, but unafraid declare our high intentions to all the living world. So the futurists also believed in the betterment of mankind through industry and war, war of all things. And this theme was in keeping with the social revolutionary movements of the era. It's kind of ironic that most of the Italian futurists were killed in World War I. I don't know if that's some kind of divine sarcasm, but that's all right. So among the other movements that actually believed that art could provide social benefits were suprematism and the Still. These avant-garde artists promoted utopian ideas, believing staunchly in art's ability to improve society and all of humankind. These efforts often surfaced as a significant political upheaval, illustrating the link between early on between revolution in politics and revolution in art. After World War I, the Russian Revolution changed the very basis of how Europeans view their government. Likewise, the world around such artists as Kazimir Malevich was changing into a new beginning that corresponded to a social transformation occurring around him in the years leading up to the revolution. Suprematists were concerned primarily with bringing art into an age of social revolution and new spiritual purpose. For Malevich, this marvelously simplistic work, the Suprematist competition, white on white square, is the creation of a simple square on a playing ground, was the moment of spiritual revelation for Malevich. In this work, the viewer sees a reduction of the painting to the simplest of all geometric relations. Very pretty much simple. I mean, I probably have something like that at home accidentally, but that's all right. This breakdown of the very basic of shapes echoes the constructionist vision of the Soviet social experiment, and makes even the simplest expressions a thing of power. So this simple square, going right back to the basic geometric forms, and if you transfer that over to the social world, then you have a basic form on which to build a new society. Likewise, I'm not going to pronounce that name. This artist in Prune 99 also breaks down the very foundation of shapes and seeks a kind of simplicity in abstract form and thought. So he represents the artist's extension of suprematism theories into the realm of architecture. Litsky, all right, let's go with that. All right, seeks a comparison of equal yet diametrically opposed forms. The black and white half circles and opposing ends of the composition, attached by a red line, the color of revolution. I don't know if that's the exact interpretation, but that's mine, so we're going to go with that. Are examples of this comparison of equals and a way to link them. Litsky and Malevich were examples of artists who were using their art to further the conceptual aims of social reformation and explore themes beyond the classical Russian ideals. Similarly, De Stijl, a movement that started by Dutch artists, espoused a social objective. In addition to promoting utopian ideals, De Stijl artists believed in the birth of a new age in the wake of World War I. They felt that it was a time of balance between individuals and universal values, when the machine would assure the ease of living. We all know how computers turned out. All right. They developed an art that was based rigorously on theories dedicated to formal purity, logic, balance, proportion, and rhythm. De Stijl works were also extremely simplified, as in Piet Mondrian's composition 21, tableau number 2. In this work, which is this, Mondrian utilizes the most basic of shapes and color schemes. The linear and rectangular forms extend into one another, and the color composition scatters and groups the forms at the same time. The piece reminds the viewer of the realities of social complexity that De Stijl embraced. The painting is not flat, everything is held firmly in place, and there is great tension, such as would be within a changing society. Mondrian is able to find harmony and balance in the sense of opposition and dominance. So yes, I read that all into these squares. Okay, so like their extension of social theory, De Stijl artists were not happy with keeping their theories solely in one medium. George Van Tongerloo's construction of volume relations, in this, De Stijl comes into the real world. The sculpture constitutes notable transformations of De Stijl painting into three-dimensional design. The piece carries the same tension and congruence as Mondrian's work. While devoid of applied color, the viewer is given a sensation of opposing forms through the natural shadows that the sculpture casts. The same continuity and extension of forms is present as one rectangular shape leads into the next. The vertical nature of the sculpture suggests an idea of construction. There's a sense of building up something, calling upon greater social themes. It is a marvelous display of opposition, cooperation, and acceptance come alive, which shows how much utility was available to artists in the new forms of modern art. So, at the very least, all of these disciplines are important to the history of modern art for how that they affect human relationship. Picasso and Braque were able to lead the way in changing the very concept of the forms of space, which allowed the futurists to smash the academy standards, to find legitimate ways to reject their traditional values, an impetus that was also expressed in the objectives of the De Stijlists, if that's a word. While the social expressions that came out of the innovations of Picasso may have been unintended, he would not have disavowed the accomplishment, as Picasso was a card-carrying communist himself. Picasso influence is directly felt in these new forms of expression in art, and he shows what could be accomplished by a return to the basic theories of art with the courage to do something original, something that every artist is passionate about accomplishing. That's it.
So our next presenter is Chris. Is that right? Yes. Yep. Okay, Chris Wesley is going to be doing a talk on museums, and his paper is entitled Museums, Monuments to Expansion and Security Work. Where does monitor? Yeah.
Okay, some of them on. Oh, here we go. Thank you. Okay, perfect. All right, ethnographic exhibitions are extremely important because they shape our concept of how we as Westerners view other cultures. Early contact with non-cultures puzzled both Europeans and Americans to struggle to understand these societies that also challenge these long-held Western assumptions about the world. Unfortunately, the earliest ethnographic exhibitions were self-serving to Westerners' goals and used to verify their own xenophobic beliefs. And the challenge for museums today is how to best display these artistically rich and highly complex cultures in a way that truly expands our knowledge about non-Western civilizations. So basically, how not to repeat past mistakes. This presentation shows both how Europe and the United States have chosen to portray other cultures and how these exhibitions have actually influenced our Western culture. Okay, discovering colonization of the New World exposed Western Europe to knowledge of cultures and natural life they'd never seen before. And I mean, when they first got to these countries and encountered these civilizations, I mean, they were really shocked. They didn't know what to make of them. You actually read their writings, the conquistadors, like personal letters and journals. They're actually trying to find ways to describe it. They're like referencing classical mythology and even fantasy novels at the time to try and explain what they're seeing. And so, you know, just like they did in their writings, they would collect these artifacts, and of course, in some cases, even animals and natives, as a way of trying to literally, you know, put these cultures back within they're really trying to understand these cultures. And they're trying to assert control over them. They're afraid by what these new civilizations represent. When you fear something, you know, putting it on your own terms is a way to, you know, basically relieve that fear. Okay, so you fast forward to the 1800s, Augustus Lane Fox, who became Pitt Rivers, created the idea that artifacts like biological specimens should be classified according to signs of progress. And of course, you know, Darwinism, Charles Darwin's theories of evolution is coming out. And of course, a lot of this was embraced by sociologists, you know, and so you have this development of social Darwinism. And again, this is all trying to, you know, relieve the anxiety that these, you know, cultures represent. Okay, the Great International Exhibition at London's Crystal Palace in 1851 actually tried to demonstrate the superiority of Europeans by, you know, showing these, you know, ethnographic art, by showing how other cultures lived. And the Paris Exposition in 1867 even displayed ancient archaeological artifacts next to, you know, this ethnographic art to try and show that these people were somehow evolutionary, you know, in evolution terms, that they were behind or stalled. However, it's also interesting to note that these exhibitions were also being used by Europeans to actually meaningfully study other cultures as well. A lot of Westerners looked at these non-Western societies, and they recognized that these you know, Eastern societies or African societies, they're actually developing. They actually notice this. Countries like China and India are actually starting to become more and more progressive technologically, just like Europe. And so they were actually scared by this. And so part of looking at these other cultures was they were really, this is the first time you start seeing Europeans, you know, start questioning, well, is our ideology correct? You know, are we, you know, is our way of doing things really the correct one or the right one? Or, you know, they're starting to ask themselves, are there other ways that we can, you know, develop? They're really trying to borrow from these cultures. And so I think this is interesting that it's not just about, you know, building themselves up. They're also asking questions. So you kind of stay in a slow progress here. Some of the ethnographic art featured in European museums was actually looted. The most famous case is the Benin bronzes, which were confiscated by British troops after suppressing a rebellion by the Oba tribe in 1897. And this is still a controversial matter today as to whether we should return this art to the countries from which it came. The problem is that there are a lot of countries that are going through political and militaristic conflict. I mean, you know, you look today at Egypt. I mean, you know, what we saw going on in Egypt is a perfect example. That threaten the safety of these artifacts. A large majority lack the resources. We are dealing with a lot of, you know, third world nations from which this came. They simply do not have you know, the conservation equipment or technology that we have. And so, and the other huge problem, of course, is European American institutions don't want to part with this. These are sources of income for them. I mean, you know, people come to the British Museum to see the Rosetta Stone. And so, you know, you have all of that. However, that being said, there are institutions that are actively trying to return artifacts. You know, we have an example here in Georgia. The Michael C. Carlos Museum has returned mummies that they have identified as important to the history of Egypt. Okay, so here's this. So now we turn to the situation in the United States in the 1800s. After gaining independence from Britain, America really started to explore, you know, the land in which they found themselves and the Native American tribes who were their neighbors. U.S. notables like, you know, Thomas Jefferson actually collected American artifacts in order to understand their culture. And in fact, his archaeological excavations of burial mounds were the first scientific archaeological excavations. So it's kind of interesting because many people were questioning, well, are these Native Americans really native? You know, I mean, a lot of people were trying to, you know, really explore this culture and understand, you know, what its impact on the, you know, landscape really was. And of course, the Lewis and Clark expedition. Again, this is more an exploration of these cultures. William Clark's museum in 1816, William Clark of the Lewis and Clark expedition actually opened a museum, and he was trying to show what he had learned to the public. You know, now it's really becoming, you know, more of a focus of scholars, and, you know, more and more people are being exposed to this. And in fact, Clark's museum actually inspired others to collect and study Native American art. He was appointed the superintendent of Indian Affairs in 1821, and he actually, in his office, prominently displayed these artifacts as a way to show Native Americans that he cared, that he really had taken an interest in their culture, and really wanted to, you know, demonstrate that he understood their needs. And I think this is especially interesting because here's the way a private ethnographic display was actually used by an individual. So I think it's kind of interesting. It's not just the major museums, private collectors are also using this. And we're going to see more of that later. And of course, the United States created these exhibitions, and, you know, because they wanted to show that their museums were just as, you know, intelligent as Europe's museums. You know, part of this is they also use these museum exhibitions to promote acquisition, exploitation of tribal lands, you know, manifest destiny. You know, it started back in Jefferson's time, and it really just continued. And museums like the Smithsonian Institution were also important. There were a lot of English visitors, or European visitors to DC. We're actually talking about how backwards Americans were, how, I mean, they really described DC as like a frontier town, you know, like the Wild West. And of course, Americans are trying to show we're just as intellectually rich and just as culturally aware as Europe. So this was kind of them, you know, they wanted to really turn themselves into an intellectual mecca of sorts, you know, people in DC. In the early 20th century, the United States extended their reach in both Asia and South America. You, of course, have Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, who are embracing this idea of like global internationalism. And part of this is they're trying to create better trade opportunities for America. In the 50s, you see more of this because of the Cold War. You know, we're trying to gain more nations to our favor and get them away from the Russians, obviously. And it's created intense public interest in products modeled after foreign styles. I mean, became huge on the marketplace. And so again, you see Americans, again, this is progressive because now we see Americans actively taking an interest in exploring these cultures and exploring these styles. And in fact, you can see, I mean, even in pop culture, this image is actually from Disneyland's Small World After All. I mean, you know, you look at the Three Amigos cartoon, and it's like you can see there was a renewed interest in our neighbors, you know, to both the South and the North. And in the early 20th century in Europe, we also see another change. Now we have modern artists like Picasso and Gauguin who are now becoming intensely interested in non-European art. Part of the reason was because, you know, these native tribes were, you know, assumed to be, you know, really closer to nature and uncorrupted by technology. And a lot of these artists had either experienced or had, friends who had experienced the carnage of World War I. They were trying to escape that. The idea of like the noble savage really, gained more and more popularity in Europe. And so, again, it's a small, we're seeing a small evolutionary step in that now we're seeing native art not as, demonstrations of how primitive they are, but demonstrations as to how, the modern artist looked at this art and instead of saying, oh, this is barbaric, this is witchcraft, this is et cetera, they're now looking at this as here is this beautiful, aesthetic artwork that we can, learn from and appreciate. And so even though they didn't understand a lot of the cultures this art came from, they were at least, showing that these native cultures actually had something to contribute. And of course, here's the Branly Museum in Paris, France today. It's also interesting the way they display the art. I really enjoy that. And so the challenge of creating an ethnographic exhibition day is, again, how to best show a culture in a way that recognizes their uniqueness in a positive light, rather than dehumanize or continue to offend them. And sometimes, despite best efforts, exhibitions, sometimes do cause controversy, they do cause offense. And part of the problem is today museums have limited financial resources. They're not as, well funded by the government as they used to be. And so, museums try to make themselves places of entertainment. They try to pander, the public wants to see cultures as strange and exotic. And so museums feel pressured to get the money they need for the educational programs they want to do. They sometimes do have to pander to people who aren't educated. They show these, cultures as kind of, alien. And others, of course, are making associations with tribal leaders. I should have mentioned this when, we were talking about the men in bronzes. A lot of them are trying to create relationships with the cultures this art comes from. So if they can't return it to the culture it originated from, they can at least, have people come in and explain what you're looking at. So a lot of them are working with, a lot of them are working with cultural leaders to, better improve the situation. So, yeah, basically, essentially what we're dealing with here is, we still struggle with this almost, dualistic aspect of how do we demonstrate native cultures in a way that respects them, and yet at the same time, it's basically how do we make these native cultures known without degrading them. I mean, it's a problem we still have today. It's a dualism. So, and that's it. Thank you.
So where's Holly?
You're getting a blinder.
I'm telling you, it's always being in the dark. Well, it's the inner sight that counts. Okay, so this is Holly Bostic, and she's going to be doing quite a complex, well, there you are, very complex paper dealing with shamanism, cosmology, ancient architecture, and a whole host of esoteric ideas. So, Holly.
All right, so this was actually a paper that Dr. Collins assigned in ancient art history, and it just explores the continuity of shamanism and animal worship in ancient art and the commonality of the cosmos and sacred space in ancient art, and I will explain in further detail as we go along. So, okay. So this first image is called the Sorcerer of Trois Frères, and which means like the Sorcerer of Three Brothers, and it's from the Cave of Three Brothers. And it is a cave painting, as you can see on the left-hand side. So basically, first of all, shamanism is any animalistic religion or instance where animals appear unrealistic or naturalistic. So in this, obviously, it's like a collaboration. There's like an owl-like face, there's deer antlers, there's a deer-like body, and yet there's like human legs and human arms and then a bushy tail. And so, of course, when we discovered this on the cave walls, had no idea what it was. Some people think it could be a shamanic insight, like they were drawing it trying to express like the wisdom of the owl and the strength of the deer and also the cunning of the human, because it looks like he could be holding a bow and arrow for hunting. Also, sometimes they were used just to like aid in the hunt. They would draw it on the wall amongst bison and such to kind of help, when they went out, they would be like, oh, well, this is gonna help us catch some dinner tonight. So this is another one from the Neolithic. It is called the seated goddess. She's a symbol of fertility and of abundance. And it's not as controversial, obviously, as the sorcerer of Clothré. However, there's still this unrealistic relationship with the animals where she's like, has her hands placed on top of these leopards. I highly doubt that in the Neolithic they had domesticated leopards. So it's very odd, to say the least. Also, if you look at the way the sculpture is formed, it's very like morphed together. They're not separated, so it's almost as if the lions or leopards are part of the seated goddess. So again, it's just that idea of this unnatural relationship with the animals that, for some reason, every culture seems to want to attain. Now, I'm sure everyone has seen the Egyptians. They obviously often depict human bodies with animal heads. You see Anubis is over here in the corner. And this is just yet another example. I think, personally, a lot of times other cultures, when they do this, it's like trying to, attain an otherworldly, godly aspect to your own life to make, it seem like there's an importance to existing. So we're going to look at some more Egyptians. The Sphinx, which is iconic, to say the least. This is, again, a morphing of a human head with an animal body, and it is supposed to be a guardian to the pyramids, as well as, I believe it was Plato. There is a myth that there is a labyrinth beneath the Sphinx, and he's again guarding that. So in all of these depictions, there's again another idea of the animals combined with the humans as a protector. As we saw with the sorcerer of Clothré, he's aiding in the hunt, keeping people safe as they go out. And again, this is guarding the burial sites of the pharaohs. These are some of my favorite creatures. They are from the Sumerians, and they're called lamasus. And they have these bull-like bodies, wings, and then the human head. And I believe the picture on the right is actually from the Metropolitan Museum. And they would actually be placed like that outside of the cities, and they were supposed to ward off evil spirits and, again, protect the city. Interestingly enough, some of them have 6 legs. And it's not quite sure whether it was like to portray a sense of movement in the piece, or whether in a 360 you would be able to see like 4 legs on each side and it just appeared that way. But it's very interesting. I don't know if that was purposeful or not. Alright. So before we move on to architecture, to just conclude what we've seen in these ancient pieces, they're all examples from all different regions, and yet they still have these similar interests and themes, which I think is absolutely fascinating. There's this sense of reverence in animals and a sort of spiritual being about them. And there's just some sort of shamanic journey that people tend to want in this relationship with animals, and something otherworldly that all human beings tend to crave and want. And I think it all stems back to an anthropology, cognitive anthropology, where I don't think we're really going to know what it is, but we're going to have to try and look at artifacts like these and learn how the people think in order to have any idea of what they were thinking when they created it, so that we can learn from it. And now we're going to move into some architecture of the ancient world. So this is Katal Hayek, and it is a city complex. And interestingly enough, as you can see in the rendering on the right, there are no doors in the entire complex. They had to take ladders up the top, and then there were little openings in the ceilings where they would go down. And I believe Dr. Collins said they would even carry their cattle down there and store it. They would just, so it's, again, this idea of like a sacred space inside. The ladder could be seen as like a stairway into the heavens and into the heavenly bodies. and just a way of getting closer to that otherworldly aspect that human beings are always trying to attain. And of course, this is what is left of Catal Hayek in excavations today. So this is the Neolithic site of Newgrange. It's in Ireland. As you can see, there's like these deep tunnels in a crucifix shape. And in front of it, there's the giant stone with the Triskele swirl patterns, which are said to represent life, death, and rebirth. And they can also be seen, since the stone is facing right in the entrance of the cave, it can be like a veil into like another world. So once you pass, then you're like in another realm. And it's often thought to be the realm of the mother goddess in the Celtic religion. Interestingly enough, the entrance also aligns with the winter solstice. So the light shines straight back all the way down the tunnel. So again, it's just this connection with the cosmos, and it's a sacred space. Everyone's favorite, Stonehenge. This is on Salisbury Plain, as I'm sure everyone knows. It aligns with the summer solstice, and it's again channeling the cosmos and trying to bring the other world closer. And I believe now they actually think that this was a burial site, which a lot of these sites tend to be. I think Newgrange was also a burial site. So were the Great Pyramids. And they were also ceremonial centers, I think, more than anything. But they align with Orion's belt, and in recent surveys of the land, there's actually an outlying pyramid that aligns with other stars. And there's these shafts that run in the pyramids, and they will actually like frame the stars. So not only is it an amazing feat in engineering, but it's just fascinating that these people would be so obsessed with trying to have such a connection with the stars and the heavenly bodies. In keeping with the Egyptians, this is Ramses II's tomb of Abu Simbel, and it again channels solstices 2 times a year. It shines all the way and lights up the entire interior. It is again a funerary complex, so another burial site that is a sacred space. Obviously, the sacred spaces, they're always grand. They usually have a tunneling area. And I think I really enjoyed in Dr. Collins' class, he asked us, what exactly makes a sacred space, like in your minds? Does anybody have any ideas? All right, well, I think, first and foremost, it's a ritual, something that you go and do over and over in this space. And then secondly, I think it's like the artifacts and what you put in the sacred space and how you build up the sacred space. So just an interesting side note. The last piece of architecture, this is the Nanu ziggurat, and it is an example of ancient Near East architecture. Ziggurats, in the first place, are pyramid-like structures with these tall towers that stretch towards the heavens. You can see it a little bit in the rendering. Again, this is just like the ladders in Catal Hayek, and they're trying to reach into the heavens, and only the kings were allowed on top of these for the most sacred of ceremonies. So it's fascinating. Some cultures, like the Egyptians, were trying to frame the stars and get closer to them that way, and others were literally trying to climb up to the heavens. So just to draw some final conclusions, we don't know why it is, but for some reason human nature, even today, there's religions, people are trying to find this relation with this otherworldly, cosmic aspect of their lives. It's just, I think, a desire to connect to something greater, to know that we're a part of something greater in the world. And I think that is about it. Thank you for your time.
Thanks, Holly. And our next performance is about performance art, and this is Hillary Coles.
use to max. Okay. Performance art is provocative. It has the ability to force an audience to acknowledge an idea that is most likely absurd, revolting, humorous, controversial, or beautiful. Yet it's not just about shock value and publicity. Performance art has played a critical role in the progression of modern art throughout the 20th century, mostly the first half. Artists use it as a way to deconstruct established art and realize new ideas and concepts. So it exists at the very foundation of nearly every school of art. The emphasis is too often placed on the paintings, sculptures, and other art objects created by futurists, Dadaists, and Surrealists. Yet those artists turn to performance first as a way of realizing and developing these new ideas that in turn led to art objects. In fact, these three schools were not at first about painting or sculpting. Futurism began as a literary movement, Dada was born in the frenzy of the Cabaret Voltaire, and Surrealism was actually a protest against realism in theater. The art objects created during these movements were byproducts of the performances that took place. So the artists who recognized today as well known were actually involved in producing these performances. For example, Pablo Picasso designed the costumes and backdrops in a pre-Dada ballet called Parade, which was presented in Paris in 1917 to particular violent outrage. Other examples include Marcel Duchamp and Man Ray, both of which performed in Surrealist productions. These are all artists who are recognized for their work outside of performance art, yet without performance, I'm sure that many of their works may never have come into existence. Those in the art community often ask the question, why? Why is performance art repeatedly left out of the history of modern art? I don't think it's intentional, it's just that performance art is very difficult to define. Defining it runs the risk of contradicting the entire idea behind performance with its limitless possibilities, imaginative disregard for the boundaries and rules. It is precisely these things which enables performance to shatter the principles of established art and create the blank canvas on which new concepts are realized. The first period of performance art encompasses Futurism, Dada, and Surrealism, and all of the artists from these movements owe something to a man by the name of Alfred Jarry. On December 11th, 1896, this 23-year-old Parisian presented a play called Ubu Roi. It was absurd. It was shocking, it was unexpected, and it was controversial. The performance consisted of only one set and costumes that lacked in color and historical accuracy. Before the curtain was raised, Jarry came out on stage, and for about 10 minutes he prepared his audience for what they were about to witness. After setting the stage and raising the curtain, the main character, Ubu, who's seen here in this image, appears and recites the first line. What he says causes the audience to erupt in riotous outrage. Translated from French, the word shit, excuse my language, was strictly prohibited in public domain in France at this time. This one tiny and simple act incites pandemonium from the audience. Fistfights break out as the play continues, and the audience is yelling and screaming and clapping, both in support and harsh criticism of this bizarre event. So after only 2 performances, Ubu Roi had left an enormous impression. It certainly influenced one of Jarry's friends, Filippo Tommaso Marinetti, who had been living in Paris at the time. Marinetti can easily be considered one of the founders of Futurism. He published the first Futurist manifesto in February of 1909, and this would be the first of countless manifestos throughout the early part of the 20th century that would help develop, along with performance, the concepts of Futurism, Dada, and Surrealism. When he returned to Italy, he immediately began planning the first of several Futurist evenings. These evenings would be improvised and bizarre, often ending with violent reactions from the audience and even police intervention. In fact, police regularly showed up to these Futurist evenings expecting violence to occur. The Futurists recognized the value of performance in disrupting a complacent public, forcing them to take notice of their ideas, and at the same time, deconstructing established art. So we can see here that the Futurist Evenings, this is actually a caricature drawn by Umberto Boccioni, if I'm pronouncing that right. This is very similar to a lot of Futurist painting you see. It's full of motion, it's full of energy, it's full of life. So it became obvious to me that these paintings came as a byproduct from these high energy Futurist evenings. And without these performances, these paintings wouldn't be what we know them as today. So in 1913, after several Futurist evenings, the Variety Theater Manifesto was published. In Marinetti's own words, variety theater was anti-academic, primitive and naive, hence the more significant for the unexpectedness and the simplicity of its means. It destroys the solemn, the sacred, the serious, and the sublime in art with a capital A. Shortly after, in 1916, Hugo Ball and Emmy Hennings started the Cabaret Voltaire in Zurich. This center for artistic entertainment quickly escalated into a highly energized scene for poets, singers, dancers, and artists of all kinds and backgrounds. Obviously, this followed the same improvised, simultaneous, volatile nature of the Futurist evenings. So after 5 months, the owner of the cafe which housed the cabaret became so disturbed by its nature that he told them they better provide better entertainment or get out. Still buzzing from the highs of the Cabaret Voltaire, Tristan Tzara wanted to organize the madness into something called Dada, which translates to yes, yes, or hobby horse, and means absolutely nothing. Ball could recognize that organization betrayed the very purpose of the cabaret, and eventually he actually withdrew from Dada activities altogether. So Dada moved from Zurich to Berlin, and the Cabaret Voltaire was replaced with the Gallery Dada. With these changes, it became more militant and daring. The violent reactions of the audience and public further provoked the Dadaists. They were actually known for going around Germany and painting the phrase, Dada kicks you in the behind and you like it, all over the place. So that can kind of give you an idea of what they were like. But Dada's high energy rebellion was soon to run its course, and as it was burning out, the artists recognized the need to bring themselves out of this impasse and find more ideas, and this is where performance comes in yet again. So the pre-Dada performance known as Parade, which I mentioned earlier, showed signs of something new, and in a preface to the program written by Guillaume Apollinaire, he describes the ballet as being a reaction to the long crises of war, and it contained an essence of the new spirit. This new spirit, he said, had the notion of surrealism. Encouraged by what seemed to be a departure from Dada, Apollinaire presented his own performance and claimed the word surrealist as his own invention to describe a new art. And you'll see here, this I think is actually a faithful reproduction of one of Picasso's costumes from this ballet. So you can kind of see how surrealism is sort of taking its form from this. So Futurism had improvised, Dada experimented with chance and simultaneous action, but Surrealism brought to life the world of dreams. The performances became less disjointed and deliberately crude, and they took on an entirely different atmosphere. They even incorporated film and photography. However, they were still met with the same outrage from the public. And with World War II, Surrealist performance effectively came to an end. The war also brought even further changes to performance art. As European exiles began arriving in the United States in the 1930s, it began to emerge here. Surprisingly, it didn't first emerge in New York, as many of us might have assumed. It actually emerged in North Carolina at a school called Black Mountain College. This small school consisted of 22 students and 9 professors, and they welcomed former Bauhaus professors Albers and Stravinsky. The small group of artists utilized performance as a way of educating themselves and exploring artistic fundamentals such as space, form, light, sound, movement, music, and time. As the college rapidly increased its number of students, 2 artists, John Cage and Merce Cunningham, were experimenting and making their own ideas known in smaller underground circles in New York as well as the West Coast. In his manifesto, The Future of Music, Cage discussed not only the presence of noise in our everyday lives, but our fascination with it. He intended on using everyday objects like beer bottles, cowbells, and pots to create music. The press saw this as being very strange, and that they just couldn't wrap their minds around it, and so surely he wasn't praised. But nonetheless, he was actually invited to put on a concert at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. Now, despite the highbrow bourgeois crowd, they were not disturbed at all. Completely unfazed. It was the exact opposite of the reaction that the European audiences had given in the previous decades. Similarly, the dancer Merce Cunningham abandoned his formal training with the Martha Graham Dance Company to realize the art and everyday movement. He proposed that natural movements such as walking or standing could be considered as dance. He said, "It occurred to me that the dancers could do the gestures they did ordinarily. These were accepted as movement in daily life. Why not on stage?" By the end of the 1940s, these two artists, Cage and Cunningham, were collaborating, and both were invited to summer school at Black Mountain College. So the experiments and performance that were going on at the school had far-reaching influence. Their untitled event, performed in 1952, had serious effects on performance art in New York in the 50s and 60s, and it paved the way to something we know as live art. In New York in 1959, a performance called 18 Happenings in 6 Parts was presented at the Rubin Gallery. This is an example of one of the rooms where this took place. It was obvious that this performance was different from any other previously presented in the United States and Europe. The artist Alan Capro had decided that it was time for the audience to have more responsibility. They should be more than mere spectators. So he issued invitations that contained vague instructions, and in it he stated, "You will become part of the happenings. You will simultaneously experience them." So people filed into these rooms one by one, sat in the chairs they were instructed to sit in, and as they moved from room to room, they would experience random noise, dance movements, other sounds, painters painting as they're watching, and bizarre events that were fragmented and had no particular meaning whatsoever. Once again, totally unfazed. The audience does not break out in violent riots or anything of that nature. So throughout the early 60s, more performances followed. The press lumped them all under the title Happenings. However, the artists themselves never agreed to this term, and it did not become a school of art the way Futurism, Dada, or Surrealism had in Europe. At the same time that the happenings were going on, there was another group of artists who were presenting very different performances, one of which is one of my personal favorites, Yoko Ono. This illustrates her cut piece, which was done in 1965, in which she had members of the audience come up and cut off pieces of her clothing one by one while she could do nothing at all. The difficulty now in understanding this performance is that none of us were there. None of us actually got to be there, feel the energy in the room, go and cut off her clothes, hear things that people may have been saying. Was there music going? Was it silent? So all we have are the pictures, and this is one reason why performance art is so difficult to explain and so difficult to define. You can't buy it and sell it like you can paintings or sculpture. So the second group was known as Fluxus. This is a term that was coined in 1961. And they acquired their own performance spaces they called Flux Hall and Flux Shop in New York. Along with these two groups, performance art in New York was becoming more diverse and varied. Dancers from California who had worked with Anne Halprin and her innovative techniques were starting to file into New York, and they were influencing other performance artists. And also, performance art was starting to reach as far as Japan, so it's becoming more of a global thing at this point in the 60s. Festivals were celebrated, performance spaces were becoming more common, and it appeared that performance was becoming something entirely different. So by the 1970s, it was considered an artistic medium in its own right. Where it had been a means of progression through the first half of the 20th century, it was now something more substantial and more widely recognized. Performance art had completely transformed art and forced the world to take notice of it. Early performances from the Futurists, Dadaists, and Surrealists awakened the audience, while the happenings demanded that they become part of the performance themselves. Up until the 1970s, it had been the catalyst of transformation in modern art, and without it, I suspect many of the visual works we've come to know as iconic would never have existed.
Very nice. Thank you, Hillary. Our last presentation today, a little different approach and segues to anthropology and history. We're going to be listening to Barry Rowan, who's going to be presenting a paper on the social and political effects of Georgia higher education and its effects here at Oglethorpe University.
So I apologize, I have nothing bad for here, so my voice isn't the best, so I apologize for that. But first, I would like to preface the presentation with a Margaret Mitchell quote. Life's under no obligation to give us what we expect. We take what we get and we're thankful. It's no more worse than it is. I chose this quote in particular because it allows one to retroactively look at the past, and we should be proactive, and we should be at the change. And if there's very little gumption or very little incentive, then the status quo would continue, even if it is good or bad, but it still will continue. And this resonates with the topic of the presentation. So shortly following the end of the Second World War, colleges saw a massive influx of new students who typically would not have had the privilege to attend such places. Oglethorpe University, under the presidency of Dr. Donald Agnew, recognized and aided groups of previously repressed individuals. He also aided Oglethorpe with a multitude of state legislative ordinances. The South faced tremendous odds with the Civil Rights Movement. Brown v. Board of Education demanded that schools should allow both races in the same facilities. There would no longer be a separate but equal facilities. Rather, all groups were entitled to the same environment, typically only accessible to the non-black members of society. The traits of a conventional American post-secondary student was still the same as before the boom. In the early 1960s, a typical student was a white male between the ages of 18 and 22. Minorities forming the lower rungs of the socioeconomic ladder were often excluded. With the advent of competition from government-funded public institutions, prestigious private colleges could no longer afford to discriminate. From 1960 to 1975, enrollment figures of public colleges increased by 20%. One study on the spread of upper education suggests that they began expanding their own financial aid programs, and formerly exclusive institutions also began opening their doors to a wider breadth of student populations. From this, a new socioeconomic class would emerge, the middle class. An emerging bourgeoisie-like class began to develop in the United States. This was followed with increased wealth and suburbanization. The first mass-produced suburb, most widely known, was announced on May 7, 1947. And nearly 2,000 homes that were planned to be built. Their purpose was to accommodate returning soldiers that would contribute to the boom of the 1950s. The mass-produced community would be called Levittown, and surprisingly, the initial number of homes did not adequately meet the demand of tenants. But how does this fit in with the civil rights movement? Well, two words: urban sprawl, which is a sort of a population leaving the urban environment to a more environment that's more on the outskirts of the city. So this led to an increased concentration of low-income households in the city. Those who could not afford to live on the outskirts of the city were normally ethnic minorities. The term "a white flight" was coined to describe this. Middle-class America determined that a college education is now a privilege, now within its grasp. On May 17, 1964, the Supreme Court of the United States stated that separate educational facilities are inherently unequal, resulting in a 9-0 vote that made Plessy versus Ferguson no longer applicable. Southern representatives then wrote the Declaration of Constitutional Principles that addressed an increased opposition. Said document cites that this unwarranted exercise of power by the court, contrary to the Constitution, is creating chaos and confusion in the states principally affected. It is destroying the friendly relations between races that have been created through 90 years of patient effort by the good people of both races. It has planted hatred and suspicion where there have been friendship and understanding. This same mindset was portrayed by local leaders in Georgia. The main tactic used by Georgians entailed the hopeful privatization of its public school system. Sachs refuted said plan and would not grant a converted institutions recognition. Without this, the educational institutions would not be recognized as respectable centers of learning. These resistors of the civil rights movement felt that the threat of a conversion to private schools and the withdrawal of the state from the realm of public education would prevent even token amounts of integration. In retrospect, this did not result in non-integration. Rather, it invited more protesters that peacefully demonstrated an opposition to the blinded Georgian democratic state government. As one could guess, the state of Georgia passed numerous codes trying to exclude African-American voters. There was a major population disparity between the urban Republican environments and the rural democratic outskirts of the state. Rather than basing the election via a population, meaning denser areas would win by sheer majority, rural areas would outvote them via a county vote system. The inability for blacks to vote was widespread. During key elections, black voters would wait hours outside polling centers without even a chance to take part in the democratic voting system. And many times, polling workers, or theoretically anyone, could question the status of the voter via the establishment of the Georgia Education Commission. This organization allows for any citizen of the state to challenge the voting qualifications of another based on citizenship, a residency, character, literacy, or knowledge of the U.S. Constitution. These actions are reminiscent of the Jim Crow laws enacted by Southern state legislations in the late 19th century. A rather archaic set of standards would sadly last until the 1960s. In just a 10-year period from 1954 to 1964, the former Confederate States of America passed over 450 laws to circumnavigate the previously mentioned Supreme Court decision of Brown v. Board of Education. With these biased laws, Southern Democrats were able to defeat any Republican foe in an election. The 1954 gubernatorial election of Marvin Griffin is a key example. Even though nearly two-thirds of Georgia, Georgia's state populace voted for his opponent, he was elected based on the previously mentioned skewed county vote system. Upon victory, he exclaimed, "Social equality is impossible. The schools are not going to be mixed with color high water." The state of Georgia would have to wait 8 years for a change. In 1962, during the re-election efforts of Griffin, Marvin Griffin received 39% of the vote, while Sanders received 58.7% of the vote. This would allow Sanders, the more moderate candidate, to claim victory. While Sanders was less of a segregationist than Griffin, there was still an overlying opinion of anti-republicanism. State leaders were able to propagandize information to sway voters in favor of socially restrictive laws towards minorities. It is often suggested that the civil rights movement was viewed as if the North is determined to reconstruct the South for the second time. Media compared the advancement of African rights with the Red Scare of the 1950s. Unsurprisingly, this drew attention amongst the populace. The NAACP was portrayed as an organization that colluded with communists. Charles Weltner, the son of Philip Weltner, a previous president of our school, a Georgia State Senator, tactfully described the predicament by saying the idea of desegregated schools was difficult to approach. There was no open discussion of the vital issue that Georgia has faced sooner or later. If something didn't happen to prevent it, the entire education system would be scuttled without so much as one voice raised in protest. Would Georgia really abandon their entire educational system just to appease segregationists? Even the United States executive branch was concerned over this issue. The president at the time, Eisenhower, especially feared that Georgia would abandon public schools. Without a public education system in place, blacks would not have the opportunity to gain any sort of learning through institutions. Oglethorpe University took a different stance on integration. They decided that one should not discriminate against any potential applicants. Dr. Donald Agnew was 8th president of Oglethorpe. Agnew faced many difficulties upon entering the position. Enrollment in private colleges was declining. In 1950, roughly 53% of students in colleges were at non-state universities or public universities. 1 decade later, 1960, the same figure would decrease to 45%. It would then further fall to less than 1/3 of all college students in 1980. Upon the arrival of the new decade following 1949, Oglethorpe would be graced with a financial surplus. Philip Weltner liquidated toxic assets, and the school is now able to operate below its expenses. He, Weltner, would introduce a plan that would progress the school academically, fiscally, and culturally. The university would gain a recognition by Sachs in 1950. The plan, in essence, was focused around the curriculum taught at the university. Weltner sided with saying a civilization is determined not by the ultimate demands of possessions, but the quality of human motivations. Thus, the Oglethorpe plan was not meant to make students financially rich per se. Rather, it would give them the cognitive capital that would progress civilization with hopes of acquiring future wealth. Afterwards, an academic audit came to the conclusion by stating, Oglethorpe turned out the kind of citizens the world needs today. And rather strangely, this closely mimics our current slogan, make a life, make a living, and make a difference. Agnew was first an advisor for Weltner. He was the main contributor to the Oglethorpe plan. He traveled extensively across the Southeast in hopes of recruiting social science scholars. Students under the plan would score 30 points higher on the GRE than the national average. With such unbridled successes, one can easily foreshadow Agnew would gain control of the institution. After the two short-lived presidencies of Bunting and Wilson, Oglethorpe was left in turmoil. Luckily, Agnew was able to fill the missing void and expand the school beyond its previously diminished status. Several sources describe the new presidency as, for the first time in its history, Oglethorpe University would be poised for a significant progress beyond mere survival. Agnew was greeted with open arms and would lead the school in an entirely new direction. The Weltner era would end abruptly with an announcement of Agnew's master plan that entailed a $3.5 million expansion program with hopes of increasing the student enrollment. He Socratically questioned the actions that were seemingly overlooked by Weltner, Bunting, and Wilson. During their respective administrations, upper education saw a rapid expanse across the country. Coincidentally, Oglethorpe remained stagnant throughout the non-expansionist eras of Weltner, Bunting, and Wilson. Agnew focused his entire presidency on a three-pronged plan, which said plan included that Oglethorpe would progress towards a passionate desire for understanding its background. Second, to promote a social growth concern and an effort to relate understanding to social programs. And lastly, to encourage a respect for competence. During his administration, Oglethorpe saw its first black student. An internal document to the Board of Trustees places the enrollment during the summer of 1963. It was then followed by a freshman enrollment all the same year. The university took that event with acceptance by saying, we are proud that the fact that this was done without fanfare and without pressure, and that these students have been accepted without a difficulty or any sort of violence. It has always been the policy of the institution to be non-discriminatory. The historic position of Oglethorpe that its policy was admissions. The historic position of Oglethorpe that its policy was the admission of students without a reference to race, creed, or color In light of this policy, Oglethorpe has treated all people the same. In the fall semester of 1963, Oglethorpe would see 443 students enrolled with a geographical distribution amongst 9 states and 9 foreign countries. The Agnew presidency enlarged the student body from under 200 to the above-mentioned figure. This would be the largest student body the school has ever seen. Many of the students that were admitted during the fall of 1963 gained their education from the military. Washington passed a sweeping set of benefits known as the GI Bill of Rights. These rights would give low-interest housing to promote home ownership, business loans to aid business, and most importantly, it allowed the government to pay your tuition at any school in America, no matter how elite or how expensive it was. 1 out of 8 individuals contributed somehow to the U.S. war effort, with nearly 8 million gaining an education from the GI Bill of Rights. While most able-bodied males left the United States to fight in the war effort, women accounted for 1/2 of the college enrollment figures during the 1940s. The GI Bill reduced a women's enrollment to approximately one-third with the arrival of the veterans. With the advent of consumerism and materialism in America, the cost was an increase. The American female would then have to enter college for a career. Families converted from a single income household to a dual income distribution with both parents contributing to the household. Along with women, non-traditional undergraduate students would also enter higher education at an unprecedented rate. Previously, those who do not fit the normal age of disparity for a college student would have avoided higher education in previous decades. Rather than neglecting their professional development, they would now enter institutions with the intention of being a part-time student. President Agnew introduced the first night classes at Oglethorpe in 1963. On July 11th, Agnew would resign his position at the head of the university. He would then accept a role to aid disadvantaged youth in the South. Consequently, he acted as a builder of facilities in the region. This would further reiterate the active role that Agnew took in allowing blacks and civil rights at Oglethorpe. The 1950s and 60s faced many speed bumps from segregation to gender equality. There was not a facet of higher education that was excluded. Women began to enroll in staggering numbers. African Americans were able to receive a secondary education, while soldiers returning from the Second World War were able to utilize the GI Bill. These groups collectively were deemed the baby boomer generation. They would gain an education, reproduce, and instill the fundamentals they acquired back to their children. Without key legislation from the federal government, education in the South might still be deemed separate equal. The government keenly used incentives to commission the southern states on behalf of the many groups that were once faced with malice.
Well, we're a little over time, but that's fine. We have another session here at Robinson 104 at 2:15. If you're interested, it's a study abroad now. So thank you for coming. Appreciate it very much. Thanks to all our presenters.